Well, class, thank you for joining me today. We're doing a video with Quinn Reid. Quinn is a policy analyst with Kansas Appleseed, which is um, located in Lawrence. And I'm going to let him share a little bit with you all about his background and how he became a policy analyst, and then what he's doing at Kansas Appleseed. So Quinn, if you would please kind of share with my students, what does it take to become a policy analyst?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit about myself, as uh, Professor Enders mentioned. I am the policy research analyst for Kansas Appleseed, and we're a nonprofit. We're headquartered in Lawrence, but we're based throughout the state, and we work to ensure that Kansas is a more just, inclusive, and thriving place. And we do this through a variety uh, of campaigns that are focused on specific policies. Um, but a little bit about my background and how I got into this work. Um, I did my undergrad at the University of Kansas and studied political science and economics. And so always, even going back to high school when I was in debate, I was interested in policies, but that kind of provides like the framework that I used to get into this work. But really, like my connection to working on policy issues was through political campaign work. I've worked on political campaigns for the last 15 years and have had a lot of experience working all the way from a local county attorney's race up to having worked on some presidential campaigns. So that was like before I started at Kansas Appleseed. That was my primary like work experience with policies. I did also go to KU Law School, but I ended up leaving before I graduated to go work on a campaign, actually. But yeah, but then one of the things that I found whenever I was working on these campaigns was that oftentimes, just as we would be getting traction on issues, it felt like we were starting to mobilize public opinion around issues that we cared about, the campaign would be over, and then it becomes about like moving on to the next election or the next thing, and it didn't feel like there was ever, or it felt like it was very difficult to maintain a sustained like pressure on particular policies, policy issues, at least from the perspective of a campaign operative. And so when I got this opportunity at Kansas Appleseed, because a couple of my friends from KU were working there, they contacted me. They knew Christina Osmeyer, our communications director, was actually a good friend of mine in undergrad, and she knew that I was looking for a new job and recommended that I look at this policy position at Kansas Appleseed, and thought that it'd be a good fit. And so I applied, and that's now what I've been doing for the last 2 years.
I think one thing, and while my students are social workers, not poli-sci students, I do think there is one thing in common between the two disciplines, and that is it's a calling. Wouldn't you agree to that? It's a passion, it's a calling.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably more so on the social work side from what I've seen. And maybe that's because political science is a little bit more nebulous, but I feel like especially though the people who are in political science who end up doing policy work, as opposed to the people who are just using it as a step to, or a placeholder because they don't know what else they're gonna do. I feel like among the people who end up making a profession in public service, who were political science majors, it is a similar type group of passionate people who feel a calling to do better for the society for sure.
So when you are looking at a policy or a series of policies, are there a couple takeaways you might share with my students or areas that you would encourage them to look at or to unpack as
Yeah,
they're looking into
absolutely,
policies?
for sure. So I feel the first thing that I always do whenever I'm researching a policy is to figure out what kind of um, academic literature already exists about it. Because I think oftentimes, we want to go out and try and reinvent the wheel or like do like some new take, and people will like jump off like half cocked, not realizing that like likely this has already been researched by people,
Right, right.
by very smart people who have spent a lot of time doing it. And so I think it's really important to do a literature review before you start doing any kind of active research, to figure out what is out there, and what the contours of the disagreements that might exist on the policy are. And then the next thing that I like to do is look and see what kind of publicly available data exists for a particular policy. And for me, I'm very much like a numbers person, a data person. So I like to me I really get my mind around an issue whenever I get some of that publicly available data, if it exists, and start playing around with the numbers in an Excel spreadsheet. And that's when I like really kind of get a sense of like, what effect is this having? Who are the people that are being affected by this issue? And then comparing like whatever findings I'm finding in the data to what exists in the literature before. And then the third like main thing that I like to do whenever I'm starting to research a topic is think outside of what is that available data and what might be missing, because oftentimes that can be even more important than what's
Right,
included
right.
in the data is what is not being recorded. Like uh, in so many topics that we work on in these fields, racial and ethnic data is a huge part of that, and it's often not tracked very well, or if it is tracked, it's tracked inconsistently, and yet we know from the research that we do have when it is tracked that race and ethnicity are a driving factor in pretty much any policy that you're going to encounter. And so any analysis that you're doing of that uh, policy is really going to be incomplete if you're not considering um, those kind of elements that might be missing, and in particular, racial and ethnic disparities.
I was doing some research on trauma informed care and homeless shelters in the Kansas City area, and I came across a tweet from a women's shelter, and it proudly shared how many women it had touched in 2017. Whether the number was 300 or something like that. But what I found interesting was what the number didn't say was how many women completed the program. And that number was very low. So that particular shelter was taking their data and manipulating it to make it look like they were doing all of this good, when in fact 90% of the women weren't completing the program. They were being exited because of behaviors attributed to their trauma, which means the organization isn't really trauma informed. So I think you're absolutely correct. Looking for what data isn't there is almost more key, which means you have to be willing, I think, to think outside the box and ask hard questions, as opposed to just accepting the data for what it is and thinking that it's, because usually it isn't. So
Absolutely, absolutely. In order to come to figure out what those pieces are that are missing, I do think though that underscores the importance of like doing the background work too, to figure out like what kind of research is there, what kind of numbers are there, because you're not going to be able to figure out what's missing if you haven't done a comprehensive search into what does exist. And so like doing both sides, I think, are very important.
Absolutely. So I have had a pleasure of reading some of your briefs. And so my students are going to write some policy briefs this semester. So what are some tips that you might give them on writing a policy brief?
I would say the number one thing is, and this is going to sound very simple, but it's to follow that structure that you're taught in school that seems like very repetitive and very like basic, but starting out by giving an overview of what you're going to tell them, then telling them, and then concluding with what the final results are. Because like, I mean, that sounds like very simple, very basic, like that structure that we learned starting probably in elementary or middle school. But I know, like, as much as I like to think that everybody's going to go in and read like every footnote I have on every graph and every like technical aspect, most people who read the reports that I've written are probably only reading the executive summary and the conclusion. And so if you're not including information in those spots, that's important. And if you're not, like, one, I think that information isn't going to get out to the decision makers that you want it to. And two, I think if you're not able to distill the complex ideas that you have in the meat of your paper into something simple, then you probably don't fully understand.
Good.
And I think the points that you're making. And so I think developing the ability to say your points concisely and be able to put them in an executive summary and put them in a conclusion will help you. Like, that process, although it might feel repetitive, will make it so that you yourself understand it, and it'll inform, I think, it'll increase the strength of the arguments that you're making. The other thing that I think is very important for that you should consider is knowing who your audience is.
Oh,
for
yeah.
a
Great point.
policy brief. So the type of brief that I'll write if we're doing outreach to lawmakers is going to be very different than the type of brief that I'll write if the intended audience for it is the general public or for stakeholders in a given thing. And so keeping in mind who that audience is and what kind of language is going to resonate with the audience without, I mean, you don't have to dumb things down, but you just think about the type of language that's going to resonate with your intended audience. I think those are probably the two most important things that I think they sound very simple, but like lots of people don't follow those simple rules, and I think that their writing and the efficacy of their advocacy work would be improved dramatically if they did.
I think those two tips are really spot on. Yes, I have gotten a psychological evaluation back on a client. I read the opening and then I skipped to the recommendations. I've seen judges do the same thing. They'll take a treatment report, they'll read the first few paragraphs, and then they'll skip right to the last page. So if you're writing 8, 9, 10 pages, whatever's in the middle is going to be totally lost. And so you do have to think about who your reader is. So for me, writing a court report and I'm writing something to a judge, I'm going to put, the emphasis up front and then the recommendations in the back end to support the front end statements. And it has to be concise. I think you're spot on with that. I don't think they're too elementary at all. There's a reason we learn those things early on, right? because they work. And so you continue to do them at, a post-academic level. So I completely agree. Well, hey, Quinn, I don't want to keep you too long. And thank you so much for kind of jump-starting my policy class. Um, I know that social workers, if you have a classroom of 20 social workers, there might be one or two that just love policy and data. The rest of them all just want to be therapists. And so I know that not everybody's going to get into that crunchy part. But the truth is, without policy and, and without the ability to look into it from a macro perspective, there'd be no room to be a therapist, right? They're all connected.
Right.
So if one of my social workers wants to be at the micro level and provide therapy through Blue Cross and Blue Shield, they need to understand Blue Cross and Blue Shield's policies at the meso and macro level to be able to do it, because without it, there's no way they can serve. So it's all connected. So, and that
Certainly.
statement's more for my students than for you, because I want them to really, embrace this crunchy stuff, because really you can't do what you want without all levels. So, all right. Well, Quinn, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording spot, but stay on for a minute. So class, thank you so much. And Quinn, thank you.
Thank you very much.